You know, there's something to be said about arriving at the exact moment when your whole world comes tumbling down, not a minute sooner, when you might have had a chance to change course. Not an hour later, when folks have already moved on to other business, but right at that precise instant when everything you'd pinned your hopes on crumbles like old leaves in autumn. I've always believed the good Lord works in mysterious ways, though sometimes his timing can seem downright peculiar. Take Clara May Whitfield, stepping off that westbound train on a Tuesday that would change her life forever. She'd traveled near 300 miles with nothing but a carpet bag, a marriage contract, and the kind of desperate hope that comes from having precious few other choices left. What she found waiting wasn't the prosperous husband she'd been promised, but something far more unexpected. Sometimes the life we think we want isn't half as good as the one we never saw coming. This here's Clara's story, and the story of a man who understood that being right on time sometimes means arriving exactly when everything goes wrong. The late afternoon sun slanted harsh across the Cedar Falls Depot platform, casting everything in that peculiar golden light that makes even the shabbiest things look almost beautiful for a spell. Clara May pressed her damp palm against the marriage contract tucked inside her handbag, feeling the paper crinkle with each nervous breath she drew. 3 long days on that cramped train car, sleeping upright against a window that rattled something fierce. 3 days of rehearsing her first words to Samuel Whitmore, the man who'd answered her carefully worded advertisement with promises of prosperity and partnership. 3 days of imagining a future that didn't involve counting every penny twice before spending it. The train's brass bell gave one final mournful clang as the engine hissed and prepared to continue its journey westward. Clara smoothed her blue calico traveling dress, her finest, though that wasn't saying much, and lifted her carpet bag with hands that trembled just slightly. "Miss, you'd be the lady for Whitmore." Clara turned toward the voice, hope flickering in her chest like a candle in drafty wind. But instead of the well-dressed gentleman she'd been expecting, she found herself facing a weathered man in railroad overalls, his cap pushed back to reveal a forehead creased with uncomfortable lines. "I'm Clara May Whitfield," she said, straightening her shoulders the way Mama had always taught her to do when trouble came calling. "Mr. Whitmore is expecting me." The station master's eyes dropped to the platform boards like he'd found something mighty interesting in the wood grain. He pulled a folded telegram from his pocket, then seemed to think better of it, stuffing it back without offering it to her. "Well now, Miss, there's been—" He cleared his throat like a man trying to swallow bitter medicine. "Mr. Whitmore, that is to say—" Clara's stomach dropped somewhere around her boot tops. She'd heard that particular tone before, the careful, measured way folks spoke when they were fixing to deliver news that would knock the wind clean out of you. "What is it?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Thank the Lord. "Whitmore took himself a wife yesterday afternoon. Had the preacher and everything." The words tumbled out in a rush, as if saying them quickly would soften the blow somehow. "Said to tell you. Well, he said you arrived too late." The platform seemed to tilt under Clara's feet like she was still on that swaying train car. She reached out instinctively, her fingers finding the rough wood of a support post. Too late. 3 days traveling toward a future that had already been claimed by someone else while she was still miles away. Trusting in a man's word. Yesterday. The words scraped past her throat like sandpaper on pine. "Yes, Miss." Real sudden like it was. The Harrison girl from over Millerville way. Her papa brought her in Monday evening, and by Tuesday noon. He spread his hands helplessly, like he was trying to catch something that had already fallen. Preacher said it was the quickest ceremony he'd ever performed. Clara stared at the man, trying to make sense of what he was telling her. Samuel Whitmore, the man who'd written such carefully polite letters about their coming partnership, who'd sent money for her train passage, who'd promised a comfortable home and steady companionship, had married another woman while she was still trusting in his word. Did he? She had to stop and clear her own throat, which felt tight as a drawn bowstring. Did he say anything else? The station master's discomfort deepened, showing plain on his weathered face. Said to give you this. He pressed a small cloth pouch into her hands, the coins inside clinking together like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. For your expenses getting back home. Clara's fingers closed around the pouch automatically. Not enough for a return ticket. She could tell by the weight of it. Maybe enough for a meal and a night's lodging if she was careful. Maybe. Around her, the normal sounds of the depot continued, as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and children's voices carried on the afternoon breeze. The train whistle gave one last fading call as it disappeared around the bend toward the next town, carrying other passengers toward futures that might actually be waiting for them. Clara stood there in that golden light, holding everything she owned in the world, and felt smaller than she'd ever felt in her 24 years. Too late. The phrase echoed in her mind like a church bell tolling for the dead. She was still standing there, trying to decide what came next, when she became aware of someone watching her with the kind of careful attention that comes from understanding trouble when you see it. 30 feet away, a man leaned against a stack of grain sacks, his dark eyes taking in her situation with the steady gaze of someone who'd seen his share of disappointments. He was tall, lean in the way of men who work hard for their daily bread, with sun-darkened skin and hands that looked like they knew their business. His clothes were clean, but well-worn, cotton shirt rolled up to show strong forearms, canvas pants that had seen honest labor. Most men would have looked away when they realized they'd been caught staring. This one didn't. He straightened slowly, setting down the grain sack he'd been checking for holes, and walked toward her with the measured pace of someone who'd made up his mind about something important. "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat, not in the flashy way of a man trying to impress, but with the simple courtesy of someone raised proper. "Couldn't help overhearing your situation." Clara lifted her chin, preparing to deflect whatever combination of pity and improper suggestions might be coming her way. She'd heard plenty of both during her journey west, though most men had at least waited until they were sure she was truly stranded before making their offers. "I'm managing just fine, thank you." The lie tasted bitter as medicine, but it was all the pride she had left. "I'm sure you are, ma'am." His voice carried no mockery, just a kind of steady calm that made her look at him more carefully. "But I've got peach trees dying for want of help, and you look like someone who knows the value of honest work." Clara blinked, certain she'd misheard him. Of all the things she'd expected to hear, an offer of employment wasn't among them. "I beg your pardon." "Got a homestead about 3 miles out. Orchard's in trouble. This summer's drought has been mighty hard on everything that grows. Could use someone who isn't afraid of getting their hands dirty." He paused, studying her face with those dark eyes. "Pays not much, but there's a roof over your head and 3 meals a day." It wasn't charity. She realized with a start of surprise. It was business. Practical. Honest. "You don't know the first thing about me," Clara said carefully. "Know you traveled a long way to get here. Know you're not the crying type, even when you've got good reason to be. Know you're still standing straight when a lot of folks would have crumpled by now." He shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying both understanding and acceptance. "That tells me what I need to know." Clara looked around the depot platform, at the station master who'd already turned his attention to other business, at the empty track where her train had disappeared, at the small town beyond, with its unfamiliar streets and uncertain prospects. Then she looked back at this stranger who'd offered her exactly what she hadn't dared to hope for, a chance to keep moving forward instead of backward. "I can work," she said quietly. "Figured you could." He picked up her carpet bag without asking permission, handling it like it weighed nothing at all. "Name's Bo Sawyer. Got a wagon over yonder when you're ready. Clara May Whitfield." "Well then, Clara May Whitfield," he said, already heading toward the waiting buckboard. "Welcome to Cedar Falls." As she followed him across the platform, Clara felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite hope yet, but maybe the possibility of it. She'd come west looking for one kind of future and found that door slammed shut in her face. But perhaps, just perhaps, another door was opening instead. Behind them, the depot settled back into its afternoon quiet, and the golden light began its slow fade toward evening. But Clara May Whitfield was no longer standing still, watching her dreams disappear down empty railroad tracks. She was moving forward, toward whatever came next. Before we continue, I'd love to know which city you're watching from. Let's get back to the story. The buckboard wagon creaked and groaned over every rut in the dusty road, each jolt sending Clara's teeth chattering together like dice in a cup. Bo Sawyer drove with the easy confidence of a man who knew every pothole and washout between town and home, but he didn't seem inclined toward conversation during the ride. Clara found herself grateful for the silence. It gave her time to study the countryside rolling past, rolling hills covered in brown grass that crunched under the wagon wheels, scrub oak trees with leaves curled tight against the summer heat, and everywhere the smell of dust and dying things. The homestead came into view as they topped a low rise, and Clara's first thought was that it looked smaller than she'd expected. A modest log cabin with a stone chimney, a small barn that had seen better days, and beyond that, rows of what must be the peach orchard Bo had mentioned. Even from this distance, she could see something was wrong with the trees. "Been a hard summer," Bo said, as if reading her thoughts. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the cabin's front porch and set the brake with a sound like breaking kindling. "Lost near half the orchard already." Clara climbed down from the wagon seat, her legs unsteady after 3 days of train travel followed by the bone-jarring ride. The ground beneath her feet was hard-packed earth, cracked into irregular shapes like a broken dinner plate. When she walked, small puffs of dust rose with each step. "Let me show you what we're up against," Bo said, leading her toward the orchard. The devastation was worse up close than it had appeared from the road. Tree after tree stood like skeletons against the afternoon sky, their branches bare except for a few withered leaves that rustled with a sound like old paper. The ones that still showed signs of life weren't much better, stunted fruit hanging like shriveled marbles, leaves yellow around the edges and curled inward. Clara walked between the rows, her boots crunching on fallen peaches that had dropped before ripening. The sweet smell of rotting fruit mixed with the dusty air, creating an odor that spoke of waste and lost hope. "This one's still got a chance," Bo said, stopping beside a tree near the creek that ran along the property's eastern edge. The tree was larger than the others, its trunk thick and gnarled with age. Though its leaves showed the same stress as the rest, green still showed through the yellow. Few others, too, if we can get enough water to them. Clara touched the bark with her fingertips. The wood felt warm and dry, like sun-baked leather. "How much water, Mom?" "More than we can carry. Less than we need." Bo pulled off his hat and wiped his forehead with his sleeve, leaving a streak of sweat and dirt. "Been hauling buckets from the creek since June, dawn to dusk, every day." The creek was maybe 50 yards from the farthest trees. Clara calculated. 50 yards of carrying heavy buckets across uneven ground, over and over, day after day. Her back ached just thinking about it. "Where would I sleep?" Bo nodded toward the cabin. Got a small room off the kitchen. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and private. They walked back toward the cabin as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Clara's dress was already damp with perspiration, and they'd only been outside for a few minutes. What would it be like spending entire days under this merciless sun? The cabin's interior was dim after the bright sunlight, and blessedly cooler. Bo showed her the small room he'd mentioned, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand. But the walls were solid logs, and the single window had glass, not just shutters. Supper's usually around 6, Bo said. Nothing fancy, but there's always enough. Clara nodded, setting her carpetbag on the bed. The mattress was corn husks. She could tell by the rustling sound it made when she pressed down on it. Not the worst she'd slept on, though far from the best. Mr. Sawyer. She turned to find him still standing in the doorway, hat in his hands. Just Bo. Bo, then, about payment. $1 a week plus room and board. His voice was matter-of-fact, businesslike. Fair wage for fair work. $1 a week. Clara had hoped for more, but it was honest money honestly earned. And more than she'd have back home, scrubbing floors for Mrs. Crawford. That's acceptable. Bo nodded and started to turn away, then stopped. Clara May morning starts early around here. Sunup. Sometimes before. I'll be ready. After he left. Clara sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked around her new home. The room smelled of wood smoke and something else. Lavender. Maybe. From sachets left behind by whoever had lived here before. Through the small window, she could see the orchard in the fading light, row upon row of struggling trees that represented her future now. Tomorrow, she would begin the back-breaking work of trying to save them, one bucket at a time. She was unpacking her few belongings when she heard it, the sound that made her freeze with her hand halfway to her traveling dress. Voices outside the cabin. Men's voices, raised in what sounded like argument. And one of them was asking about a woman who'd arrived on today's train. Clara's palms were on fire by the time she reached the creek for the third trip. The wooden bucket handles had carved grooves into her soft skin. And every step back toward the orchard sent pain shooting up her forearms like lightning strikes. She paused at the water's edge, watching the clear stream bubble over smooth stones, and dunked her hands into the cool current. The relief lasted exactly as long as it took to grip those bucket handles again. Bo worked 20 yards away, moving between the withered peach trees with the steady rhythm of a man who'd performed this same ritual countless times. His cotton shirt had darkened with sweat across his shoulders, and his boots had worn a clear path through the cracked earth between the creek and the farthest row of dying trees. The sun climbed higher, pressing down like a wool blanket in July. Clara's brown work dress, the practical one she'd changed into after realizing her traveling clothes wouldn't survive a day of this labor, clung to her back and under her arms. The fabric pulled and tugged with every movement, sticking to her skin like wet paper. By her 6th trip to the creek, blisters had formed on both palms. By her 8th trip, one had burst open, leaving raw skin that screamed every time she adjusted her grip on the bucket handles. Clara bit down hard on the inside of her cheek and kept walking. Water's got to find the roots, Bo called from beside a tree that still showed patches of green among its yellowing leaves. He was crouched down, using his finger to trace a shallow depression around the tree's base. See how the ground's shaped here? Clara set down her buckets and walked over, grateful for any excuse to rest her burning hands. The earth around the tree trunk was baked hard, split into jagged pieces like a broken ceramic bowl. But there was indeed a slight hollow where the main roots emerged from the trunk. Tree's been reaching for water so long it carved out its own little basin, Bo explained, not looking up from his work. Pour the water there, and it soaks down where it's needed instead of running off. Clara nodded and returned to her buckets. The metal handles felt like brands against her torn palms, but she forced her fingers to close around them. When she poured the next buckets, she aimed for those natural basins, watching the precious water disappear into the thirsty earth with a soft gulping sound. The sun reached its peak, turning the air thick and shimmery. Clara's shadow had shrunk to a small puddle at her feet, offering no relief from the relentless heat. Sweat dripped from her chin onto the dusty ground, leaving dark spots that vanished almost immediately. Her legs shook with fatigue as she made what felt like her 100th trip to the creek. The buckets seemed to grow heavier with each journey, water sloshing against her calves and soaking through her boots until her feet squelched with every step. Bo had moved to the far end of the orchard, still maintaining that same measured pace. Through the heat shimmer, she could see him bent over another struggling tree, working with the patience of a man who understood that some battles were won one small victory at a time. Clara wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist and immediately regretted it. Her sleeve was soaked with perspiration and only spread the moisture around, making her skin feel clammy despite the brutal heat. She was bending to fill her buckets when the world tilted sideways without warning. The creek bank rushed up to meet her knees, and she found herself gripping the bucket handles like anchors while the landscape swayed gently around her. The water looked so cool, so impossibly inviting. She could see minnows darting between the rocks, quick silver flashes in the clear current. "Easy there." Bo's voice seemed to come from a great distance, though when Clara looked up, he was crouched right beside her. His face was shaded by his hat brim, but she could see concern in the set of his mouth. "Just need a moment," Clara managed, though her tongue felt thick and unwieldy in her mouth. "Need more than a moment." Bo took the buckets from her hands and set them aside. "Need water inside you, not just on your hands." He produced a battered tin cup from his shirt pocket and dipped it in the creek. The water that emerged was crystal clear, cold enough that droplets formed on the cup's surface almost immediately. "Slow sips," Bo warned, holding the cup out to her. "Too fast, and your stomach'll reject it." The water was sweet and cold and tasted faintly of the stones it had flowed over. Clara forced herself to drink slowly, though every instinct screamed at her to drain the cup in desperate gulps. The liquid seemed to spread through her body like morning sunlight, cooling her from the inside out. "Better," Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. The world had stopped its gentle spinning, and her legs felt more solid beneath her. "Heat takes some getting used to," Bo said, refilling the cup without being asked. "Especially if you're not born to it. We get hot summers back home." Clara accepted the second cup, sipping more steadily now. "Just not quite like this." "Desert heat's different," Bo agreed. "Pulls the moisture right out of you. Got to drink before you feel thirsty, or you'll spend the whole day trying to catch up." He settled back on his heels, studying her with those dark eyes that seemed to notice everything. "You don't have to prove anything. You know." "I'm not trying to prove anything." The words came out sharper than Clara intended. "I'm trying to work." "Working yourself into the ground won't save any trees." Clara finished the second cup of water and handed it back, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. His hands were calloused and steady, warm despite the cool water he'd been handling. "I can do this job," she said quietly. "Never said you couldn't." Bo stood and offered her his hand. "But you can do it smart, too." So Clara let him help her to her feet, hating how much she needed the assistance. Her legs felt like they were made of water instead of bone and muscle. "Shorter trips from now on," Bo said, picking up her abandoned buckets. "More frequent, but easier on your hands. That's not efficient. Efficient is whatever keeps you upright long enough to get the job done." The rest of the morning passed in a haze of smaller loads and more frequent water breaks. Clara's blisters didn't heal, but she learned to hold the buckets differently. spreading the weight across her palms instead of concentrating it on the worst spots. Her legs stopped trembling, though they still felt like they belonged to someone else. By the time the sun began its slow arc toward afternoon, they had watered every tree in the orchard at least once. Clara stood in the shade of the largest peach tree, one of the few that still showed more green than yellow in its leaves, and surveyed their work. The ground around each tree was dark with moisture, and the air smelled different somehow, not just of dust and dying vegetation, but of something else, something that might have been hope, if hope had a scent. "They're drinking," Bo said, coming to stand beside her in the blessed shade. Clara looked at the nearest tree and realized he was right. The water they'd poured around its base had soaked completely into the earth, leaving only the faintest trace of dampness on the surface. Somewhere below, invisible roots were pulling that moisture deep into wood that had been thirsting for months. Will it be enough? For today? Bo pulled off his hat and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. His hair stuck up at odd angles, dark with sweat. "Tomorrow we'll do it again." The simplicity of that statement was both daunting and oddly comforting. Tomorrow they would carry water. The day after that, they would carry more water. Day after day until the trees lived or died, until the drought broke or didn't, until something changed the equation entirely. Clara's stomach chose that moment to remind her that she hadn't eaten since the biscuit and coffee Bo had provided at dawn. The hollow ache in her middle had been easy to ignore while she was focused on the work, but now it demanded attention with sharp insistence. "Hungry?" Bo asked. As if he'd heard her stomach growling, Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak around the sudden intensity of her appetite. They walked back toward the cabin in comfortable silence, their shadows growing longer as the afternoon light slanted through the surviving peach leaves. Clara's boots squelched with each step, and she could feel grit working its way between her toes where the wet leather had stretched and warped. The cabin felt blessedly cool after hours in the direct sun. Bo moved around the small kitchen with practiced efficiency, pulling ingredients from shelves and cabinets that Clara was only beginning to recognize as her new home. Cornmeal from a large tin container, bacon grease from a covered crock that sat near the stove, salt from a small wooden box, water from a covered bucket on a stand by the back door. Clara watched him work, noting the economy of his movements, the way he measured ingredients by eye and experience rather than with spoons or scales. His hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady despite the morning's hard labor. "Can I help? Sit." Bo nodded toward one of two wooden chairs at the small table. "You've earned your rest," Clara wanted to argue, but her legs were already making the decision for her. She sank into the chair with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. The kitchen smelled of old fires and bacon grease, comfortable scents that reminded her of childhood mornings before everything became complicated. Bo worked at the cast-iron stove, spooning batter into a hot skillet that hissed and popped when the cornmeal hit the grease. "How long have you been fighting this drought?" Clara asked. 3 months, maybe 4. Bo didn't look up from the skillet, using a wooden spoon to check the edges of the forming cornbread. "Started gradual-like, then got serious when the creek dropped 2 feet in July. And before that, this was some of the prettiest country you ever saw." His voice carried a note of loss that spoke of better times. Peach blossoms in spring looked like pink snow on the trees. The cornbread was ready sooner than Clara expected. Bo lifted it from the skillet in one golden piece, the edges crackling slightly as it cooled. He cut thick wedges and placed 2 on a plate in front of her, along with a small crock of butter that had somehow survived the heat. The coffee came from a pot that had been simmering on the back of the stove, dark and strong enough to stand a spoon in. Clara's first sip made her eyes water, but it was hot and fortifying, exactly what her exhausted body needed. They ate in companionable silence, both too hungry and too tired for much conversation. The cornbread was coarse and filling, with a slightly gritty texture that spoke of cornmeal ground fresh and local. Clara spread butter while it was still warm enough to melt, watching the golden liquid soak into the bread's rough surface. Outside, the afternoon heat continued its assault on the world, but inside the cabin, with food in her stomach and water in her body, Clara felt something she hadn't dared to feel in weeks. She felt like she belonged somewhere. Her hands were torn and blistered, her back ached, and every muscle in her legs protested when she shifted in her chair. But she had carried water to dying trees and watched them drink. She had worked beside a man who asked nothing of her except honest labor and gave nothing but honest respect in return. Clara was reaching for her second piece of cornbread when movement outside the kitchen window caught her eye. A rider was approaching down the main road, moving at a deliberate pace despite the heat. As the figure drew closer, Clara could make out details that made her mouth go dry. A woman in a black dress, sitting ramrod straight in a buggy despite the oppressive temperature. And she was looking directly at Beau's cabin with the focused intensity of someone who had come here for a very specific purpose. The woman in the buggy turned out to be Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring farm, her black wool dress somehow managing to look crisp despite the dust cloud that had followed her down the road. Clara watched through the kitchen window as the older woman climbed down from her seat, with the careful movements of someone who took appearances seriously, smoothing her skirts and adjusting her bonnet before approaching the cabin. Beau had spotted her too. He set down his coffee cup and moved toward the front door, pausing to wipe his hands on a dish towel with more care than the simple gesture required. "Afternoon, Mrs. Henderson," he called from the porch, his voice carrying the polite distance that neighbors maintained when conducting business. "Mr. Sawyer." The woman's voice was crisp as autumn air, formal as Sunday service. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Clara remained seated at the kitchen table, uncertain whether she should make herself known or stay hidden. The decision was taken from her when Mrs. Henderson's sharp eyes found her through the open doorway, taking in every detail with the thoroughness of someone conducting an inspection. "Oh, I see you have company." "Clara May Whitfield," Beau said, gesturing for Clara to join them on the porch. "She's helping with the orchard work." Clara rose on legs that still trembled slightly from the morning's exertion and walked to the doorway. Mrs. Henderson's gaze catalogued everything: the sweat stains on Clara's dress, the dirt caked under her fingernails, the way her hair had escaped its pins during hours of hard labor. "How do you do?" Clara said, offering the slight nod that courtesy required. "Miss Whitfield?" Mrs. Henderson's tone held the particular chill reserved for situations that didn't quite meet social expectations. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Clara arrived yesterday," Beau said. "From back east." "I see." Mrs. Henderson's attention moved between them like a hawk studying field mice. "And you'll be staying where?" "Exactly." "In the back room," Clara answered quickly, feeling heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "Mr. Sawyer has been kind enough to provide lodging in exchange for work." The words hung in the still air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Mrs. Henderson's expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested she'd heard exactly what she'd expected to hear, and found it wanting. "How practical." She adjusted her black gloves with deliberate precision. "Mr. Sawyer, might I have a word privately?" Beau's jaw tightened in a way that was barely visible unless you were looking for it. "Anything you need to say can be said in front of Miss Whitfield." "I think not." Mrs. Henderson's smile was thin as paper and just as fragile. "This concerns certain proprieties that need to be observed in a community like ours." Clara felt her stomach clench like a fist. She'd expected this conversation eventually, but not so soon. Not when she was still figuring out what this arrangement actually meant, what boundaries existed between necessity and impropriety. Perhaps I should check on the trees, she said, starting to step off the porch. Stay put. Beau's voice was quiet but carried an edge Clara hadn't heard before. Mrs. Henderson was just leaving. Mr. Sawyer, the older woman's voice sharpened like a blade being drawn across a whetstone. I'm only thinking of your reputation. And hers, of course. Our reputations are our own concern. Not when they affect the whole community. Mrs. Henderson clasped her hands in front of her black skirts with the air of someone delivering an unpleasant but necessary truth. People talk, Mr. Sawyer, especially about young women living in unconventional arrangements with unmarried men. Clara's fingers found the porch railing, gripping the rough wood hard enough to drive splinters into her already damaged palms. The pain was sharp and immediate, a welcome distraction from the conversation unfolding around her. Miss Whitfield is working to save dying trees, Beau said, his voice level as still water. Nothing unconventional about honest labor for honest wages. Of course not. Mrs. Henderson's smile never wavered, though it seemed to grow thinner with each word. But appearances matter, don't they? And a young woman, alone with a man, no proper chaperone or family nearby. She let the implication trail off like smoke dissipating in the heat. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. Clara could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could smell the dust that coated everything in this dry country, could feel perspiration beading along her hairline despite the shade of the porch. What would you suggest? Clara asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Mrs. Henderson turned toward her with something that might have been relief, as if Clara had finally asked the right question. Why? There are proper situations available in town. Mrs. Crawford needs help with her boarding house. Very respectable work for a young lady. Respectable work that pays next to nothing, Beau observed. Money isn't everything. Mr. Sawyer, a woman's reputation is worth far more than wages. Mrs. Henderson's tone suggested this was a truth so obvious it hardly bore stating. Clara looked between them, seeing the battle lines being drawn with the clarity of someone who'd spent her life caught between other people's expectations. Mrs. Henderson represented safety, respectability, the approved path that led to social acceptance and slow starvation. Beau represented something different. Independence. Maybe, or at least the possibility of it. I appreciate your concern, Clara said carefully, testing each word before she spoke it. But I've made my choice. Have you? Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose like birds taking flight. Or has your choice been made for you by circumstances beyond your control? The question struck closer to home than Clara cared to admit. How much of this was real choice, and how much was simply accepting the only option available to a woman with nowhere else to go? Same thing, sometimes, Beau said, his words carrying the weight of experience. Mrs. Henderson sighed, the sound carrying what seemed like genuine regret. Mr. Sawyer, you're a good man. I've never heard anyone in this community say otherwise. But this situation... She gestured vaguely at Clara, at the cabin, at the whole sun-baked scene before them. It's not fair to either of you. Life's not fair, Beau replied. But it can be honest. And when winter comes, when there's no orchard work to be done, what then? The question hung in the afternoon air like a storm cloud on the horizon. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach despite the oppressive heat. She hadn't thought beyond the immediate crisis, beyond saving enough dying trees to justify her presence here. Winter seemed impossibly distant when the current challenge was simply surviving each day under this merciless sun. We'll figure it out, Beau said, but Clara heard the uncertainty beneath his confident words. Will you? Mrs. Henderson's voice carried a note that seemed less like judgment and more like genuine worry. "Mr. Sawyer, I've seen too many good people make choices that seemed right in the moment but led to heartbreak down the road." Clara studied the older woman's face, looking for signs of malice or gossip-mongering. Instead, she found something that looked almost like compassion, the concern of someone who'd seen how these stories usually ended. "Thank you for your concern," Clara said again, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "I'll keep your suggestions in mind." Mrs. Henderson nodded, gathering her skirts as she prepared to return to her buggy. "Miss Whitfield, if you change your mind, Mrs. Crawford's boarding house is on Elm Street. Tell her I sent you." She climbed back into her buggy with the same careful precision she'd used to dismount, checking her appearance once more in the small mirror attached to the vehicle's side. The horse, a sturdy bay mare that looked as practically minded as her owner, shook her head and stamped one front hoof impatiently. "Mr. Sawyer," Mrs. Henderson said as she gathered the reins, "you're walking a narrow path. Don't let pride lead you astray." The buggy rolled away, raising another cloud of dust that settled slowly in the still air. Clara watched until it disappeared around the bend in the road, then became aware of Beau's presence beside her, on the porch, solid and reassuring as the cabin itself. "You don't have to stay," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the distant sound of the retreating buggy. Clara turned to look at him. His face was carefully neutral, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands gripped the porch railing as if anchoring himself against uncertainty. "Do you want me to leave?" "That's not what I asked." "It's what you meant." Beau was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dusty road where Mrs. Henderson's buggy had vanished. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough around the edges, like sandpaper on raw wood. "Had a situation before. Different woman, different circumstances. But people talk then too." Clara waited, sensing there was more to come, that this admission had cost him something. "She listened to them," Beau continued, his words coming slow and deliberate. "Decided her reputation was worth more than whatever we had building between us. What happened to her? Married a banker in town. Safe choice. Respectable." His laugh held no humor whatsoever. "Died in childbirth 2 years later. Baby, too." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, sudden and unexpected. She understood now why Beau had defended her so fiercely, why Mrs. Henderson's suggestions had made his jaw tighten with old pain. "I'm not her," Clara said. "I know that." Beau finally looked at her, his dark eyes holding something she couldn't quite name. "But people like Mrs. Henderson, they see patterns everywhere. Young woman in trouble, older man with land. They think they know how the story ends." "How does it end?" "Don't know yet." Beau's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's the trouble with stories that are still being written. You don't know the ending until you reach it." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the yard, while the heat pressed down around them like a living thing. Clara's hands had stopped shaking, and the cold knot in her stomach had begun to ease. Whatever came next, at least she understood the stakes now. "The trees need watering again," she said finally. "They do. Then we'd better get to it." They walked toward the orchard together, their footsteps raising small puffs of dust in the packed earth. The peach trees waited in their patient rows, leaves rustling softly in what might have been the ghost of a breeze. Clara was picking up her buckets from where she'd left them beside the largest tree when she heard something that made her freeze in place. Thunder. Distant, but unmistakable, rolling across the valley like the sound of God moving furniture in heaven. She looked up at the sky, still blue and cloudless as far as the eye could see. Then at Bo, who was standing perfectly still with his head tilted back, listening to something only he could hear. "Storm coming," he said, and his voice carried a note she'd never heard before, something that sounded almost like hope. The thunder rumbled again, longer this time, rolling across the valley like freight cars coupling together in the distance. Clara set down her buckets and shaded her eyes with one hand, scanning the western horizon where the sound seemed to originate. Still nothing but clear blue sky and the shimmer of heat rising from the baked earth. "You sure about that storm?" she asked. Bo was already moving, his earlier leisurely pace replaced by something urgent and purposeful. "Smell the air." Clara breathed deep, trying to catch whatever scent had changed his entire demeanor. At first, there was nothing but the usual mixture of dust and dying vegetation that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Then, carried on what might have been the faintest stirring of breeze, she caught something else, something green and sweet and alive. "Rain," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "Still a ways off, but it's coming." Bo was already heading toward the cabin, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each hurried step. "Need to get every container we can find. Every bucket, basin, pot, and pan." The next hour passed in a whirlwind of preparation that felt like getting ready for battle. They dragged containers out of the cabin, the barn, the root cellar. Anything that would hold water became part of their desperate collection system. Clara found herself running between buildings, her earlier exhaustion forgotten in the face of this unexpected opportunity. A wash basin from behind the cabin, 3 more buckets from the barn, a large pot with a dented bottom that would still hold precious rainwater. Even an old bathtub that Bo hauled out from somewhere behind the barn, its porcelain surface stained but intact. The western sky began to darken as they worked, clouds building like mountains on the horizon. At first they were white and innocent-looking, the kind of clouds that promised shade but little else. But as Clara watched, their bases turned gray, then black, pregnant with the moisture this land had been craving for months. Lightning flickered deep inside the cloud mass, not the sharp, dangerous bolts that preceded immediate storms, but the diffuse glow that spoke of rain still miles away but definitely approaching. The thunder that followed was deeper now, more insistent, a bass note that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. "How much time do we have?" Clara asked, positioning a wash basin where runoff from the cabin's roof would collect. "Hour, maybe less." Bo was arranging pots and pans in a careful pattern around the yard, calculating angles and water flow with the expertise of someone who understood that every drop would count. "These summer storms, they build fast once they get going." The air pressure began to drop, creating a hollow sensation in Clara's ears that made the world sound muffled and strange. The horses in Bo's small pasture had begun moving restlessly, lifting their heads and snorting as they sensed the approaching change, with instincts older than human weather prediction. The first real breeze arrived like a scout ahead of an advancing army, stirring the dust in small whirlwinds and setting the peach leaves chattering with a sound like applause. Clara's hair, already loose from the day's hard work, whipped around her face in damp tendrils. Thunder crashed overhead, close enough now to rattle the cabin windows in their frames. Lightning followed a heartbeat later, illuminating the entire yard in stark white relief that made every shadow sharp as a knife blade. In that split second of electric daylight, Clara could see the storm approaching like a dark wall across the valley, rain falling in gray curtains that obscured the distant hills. "Here it comes," Bo said, his voice barely audible above the rising wind. The first drops arrived like scouts, fat and warm and widely spaced. Clara felt one hit her forehead, then another on her nose, each one a small miracle of wetness in this parched land. She looked up just as the scattered drops became a steady patter, Then a downpour that seemed to fall with the sudden intensity of water bursting from a broken dam. Within seconds, Clara was soaked to the skin. The rain fell with a force that stung her upturned face and plastered her dress to her body, but she didn't care. After days of carrying water one bucket at a time, the sensation of it falling freely from the sky felt like a gift from heaven itself. She stood in the middle of the yard with her arms spread wide, face turned upward, letting the clean water wash over her like a benediction. The rain tasted of sky and distance and the promise of growing things. It ran down her neck and under her collar, cool and sweet and perfect. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed immediately by thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. In the brief moment of illumination, Clara could see Bo moving through the storm like a man possessed, adjusting containers and checking angles even as the rain soaked him to the bone. "Clara," his voice cut through the noise of wind and water. "Help me with this." She opened her eyes to find him wrestling with a large canvas tarp that the wind was trying to tear from his hands. Clara grabbed one corner and together they stretched it between two fence posts, creating a makeshift funnel that directed the precious rainwater into the old bathtub they'd positioned below. The rain drummed against the canvas with a sound like 1,000 fingers tapping, and within minutes the improvised system was channeling a steady stream of clear water into the tub. Clara watched the level rise with something approaching euphoria, seeing their desperate bucket-carrying efforts multiplied 100-fold by nature's own abundance. Thunder rolled overhead in continuous waves now, and the lightning came so frequently that the world seemed to flicker between daylight and darkness. The wind whipped the rain in horizontal sheets that stung Clara's face and made it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. She was adjusting her grip on the tarp when she noticed Bo watching her through the downpour. His hair was plastered to his head, water dripping from his chin and the brim of his hat. But his eyes held something she'd never seen before. Something warm and surprised and almost wondering, without quite knowing why. Clara found herself laughing, not the polite, restrained laughter of social occasions, but the pure, unguarded joy of a child discovering snow for the first time. The sound seemed to unlock something in Bo, and suddenly he was laughing too, rich and deep and utterly free. They stood there in the storm, holding a tarp between them and laughing like people who'd been given an unexpected reprieve from disaster, while the drought-starved earth opened up and drank deep. The storm lasted 47 minutes by Clara's count, though it felt both longer and shorter than that. When the rain finally began to ease, they walked through the yard surveying their success with the satisfaction of soldiers who'd won an important battle. Every container was full or overflowing. The bathtub had filled completely and was sending a small river across the yard toward the orchard. Puddles reflected the clearing sky, and somewhere in the distance, a bird began to sing. The first bird Clara had heard since arriving at the homestead. The air smelled different now, clean and sweet and electric with possibility. Steam rose from the wet earth in ghostly tendrils, carrying that distinctive scent of rain on dry ground that had a name in some languages but no adequate translation in English. "Look at them," Bo said, pointing toward the orchard. Clara followed his gaze and felt something shift in her chest like a gear clicking into place. The peach trees, which had looked defeated just hours earlier, seemed to have lifted their branches toward the gray sky. Leaves that had been curled tight with drought stress were already beginning to unfurl, and she could swear she could see the trees responding to the water they'd been craving. They walked between the rows together, their feet squelching in mud that had been dust that morning. Every depression in the ground had become a small pond, and the air was full of the sound of water trickling and gurgling as it found its way to thirsty roots. "Think it'll be enough?" Clara asked, running her hand along the wet bark of the nearest tree. "For now." Bo stopped beside a tree that had been among the worst affected, its leaves yellow and sparse just that morning. Already, Tiny beads of moisture clung to the surviving foliage like jewels. Sometimes that's all you can ask for. They made their way back to the cabin as the sun broke through the dissipating clouds, turning the wet world into a landscape of diamonds and gold. Clara's dress hung heavy with water, but she felt lighter than she had since stepping off that train in Cedar Falls. The cabin felt warm and welcoming after the drama of the storm. Bo built up the fire in the cook stove while Clara attempted to wring some of the water from her hair and restore a semblance of order to her appearance. The kitchen filled with steam from their wet clothes and the familiar, comforting smell of coffee beginning to percolate. They sat at the small table sharing cornbread and butter, while the last of the thunder rumbled away to the east like a departing freight train. Clara's hands had stopped shaking from the cold, though she could still feel the electric charge of the storm in her bones. "Thank you," she said suddenly, the words coming out before she could stop them. Bo looked up from his coffee, rainwater still dripping occasionally from his hair. "For what?" "For letting me be part of this. For not making me feel like—" She struggled for the right words. "Like what Mrs. Henderson thinks I should feel ashamed of." "What does Mrs. Henderson think you should be ashamed of?" The question was asked so mildly that Clara almost missed the challenge hidden beneath it. She looked up to find his dark eyes fixed on her face, steady and serious in the lamplight. "Being a burden, I suppose. Being someone who needs rescuing." Clara stirred her coffee, watching the cream swirl in patterns that reminded her of storm clouds. "Maybe she's right." "About which part? I don't know." The admission came out smaller than she'd intended. "Maybe all of it. Then maybe what Mrs. Henderson thinks doesn't matter as much as what you think." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, listening to the steady drip of water from the eaves and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Clara found herself studying Bo's face in the lamplight, noting how the tension had left his shoulders since the rain began, how his expression had softened into something that looked almost like contentment. "Bo," she said as he rose to clear the dishes. What happened to her?" "The woman you mentioned before." His hands stilled around his coffee cup. For a moment Clara thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd pushed too far into territory that wasn't hers to explore. Then he set the cup down and leaned back in his chair. "Her name was Sarah Mitchell. Met her at a church social about 3 years back, when I was still trying to make my first farm pay." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, like he was recounting someone else's story. Pretty girl, sweet disposition. Had clear ideas about how life should go. What kind of ideas? The usual kind. Nice house, store-bought dresses, children who'd never know what it meant to go without. Bo's mouth curved in a smile that held more understanding than bitterness. "Problem was, I couldn't give her those things. Not then. Anyway," Clara waited, sensing there was more. "Drought hit that summer too. Though not as bad as this one. Lost most of my crops. Had to sell the livestock to cover debts. Sarah." He paused, choosing his words with care. "Sarah decided she'd rather be comfortable than uncertain." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. She made the right choice for herself. Banker's wife suited her better than struggling farmer's wife would have." Bo picked up his coffee cup again, turning it slowly in his hands. "Just took me a while to see it that way." Clara studied his face, looking for signs of old pain or present bitterness. Instead, she found something that looked like acceptance, maybe even peace. "Do you regret it, losing her?" "Used to, but sitting here now, listening to the rain soak into ground that's been thirsting for months." He shrugged, a gesture that seemed to encompass the storm, the farm, maybe even Clara herself. "Hard to regret something that brought you where you need to be." The simple words hit Clara with unexpected force, warming something in her chest that had been cold for longer than she cared to remember. Outside, the last of the storm clouds drifted away, leaving a sky washed clean and scattered with early stars. She was reaching for her coffee cup when a sound made her freeze with her hand halfway to the handle. Footsteps on the front porch, heavy, deliberate, moving with the kind of confidence that came from having every right to be there. Clara's eyes met Beau's across the table, and she saw her own sudden tension reflected in his face. Someone was knocking on the door, and at this hour, after a storm like that, visitors usually meant one thing: trouble. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. 3 sharp raps that echoed through the small cabin like hammer blows on an anvil. Beau rose from his chair, the legs scraping against the wooden floor with a sound that made Clara's jaw clench. He moved toward the front door with measured steps, his hand automatically checking that his shirt was properly tucked, the way a man does when he's expecting to conduct serious business. "Who's calling?" he asked through the closed door. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to speak with you. Mr. Sawyer." Clara felt her stomach drop like a stone down a well. The older woman's voice carried a note of urgency that hadn't been there during her afternoon visit. Something sharp and determined that cut through the damp evening air like a blade. Beau glanced back at Clara, his expression unreadable in the flickering lamplight. She could see tension gathering in the set of his shoulders, the way his fingers flexed at his sides like he was preparing to handle something heavy. The door opened with a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. Mrs. Henderson stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her black dress somehow still crisp despite the recent downpour. Water dripped from the edges of her bonnet, leaving dark spots on the wooden floor like teardrops. "Mrs. Henderson." Beau's voice held careful politeness, the tone a man uses when he's not sure if he's talking to friend or foe. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I imagine not." The older woman's gaze swept the kitchen with the thoroughness of someone conducting an inventory, taking in the 2 coffee cups on the table, the lamp burning low between them, the intimate atmosphere of a shared evening meal. Her mouth tightened in a way that spoke louder than words. Clara remained seated at the table, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup like it was an anchor in rough seas. Standing would seem either respectful or defensive, and she couldn't decide which would serve her better in whatever was about to unfold. "Is there something you need?" Beau asked. Mrs. Henderson reached into her black handbag and pulled out a folded paper, handling it with the careful precision of someone delivering unwelcome news. The paper looked official, with heavy creases and what might have been a government seal visible through the folds. "I thought you should see this before it becomes common knowledge around town," she said, holding the document out to Beau. He took it with obvious reluctance, the paper rustling like dry leaves as he unfolded it. Clara watched his face as he read, saw the moment when his expression hardened into something cold and distant as winter stone. "What is it?" Clara asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Beau's jaw worked silently for a moment before he spoke. "Telegraph from town. Seems Samuel Whitmore is claiming I stole his intended bride." The words hit Clara like a fist to the stomach, driving the breath from her lungs and making the room spin around her. She gripped the table edge harder, feeling the rough wood bite into her palms. "He what?" "Says you were legally contracted to marry him, and I interfered with that contract by offering you employment." Beau's voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a newspaper account of someone else's troubles. "Claims it amounts to theft of property." Mrs. Henderson clasped her hands in front of her black skirts with the air of someone who'd rather be anywhere else but knew her duty. "He's threatening to bring charges. Mr. Sawyer, breach of contract at minimum. Possibly interference with lawful business arrangements, depending on how he chooses to frame the situation." Clara's throat felt like someone had wrapped a rope around it and was slowly tightening the knot. But he married someone else. He abandoned the contract first. That's not how he's telling the story. Mrs. Henderson's tone held no satisfaction. Only the grim resignation of someone who'd seen how these things usually played out. He claims he waited until the appointed day, and when you failed to arrive on schedule, he assumed the contract was void, says he had no way of knowing you were merely delayed by travel difficulties. That's a bold-faced lie. Clara's voice came out rougher than she'd intended, scraping past her tight throat like sandpaper. The station master told me plain as day that Whitmore married that woman the day before I arrived. A full day before. The station master's word against a man with money and influence. Mrs. Henderson folded her hands tighter, knuckles showing white through her black gloves. And Mr. Whitmore has both, plus the kind of social standing that carries considerable weight in legal proceedings. Bo was still staring at the telegraph, his knuckles white where he gripped the paper. What's he want? According to this, he wants Miss Whitfield returned to fulfill the original contract. Failing that, he wants monetary compensation for his expenses and what he's calling damage to his reputation. Clara felt something cold and heavy settle in her stomach like a stone. Returned like I'm a piece of livestock that wandered off. A contract is a contract, dear. Mrs. Henderson's voice softened slightly, carrying what might have been genuine sympathy. Legally speaking, you did agree to marry him. The fact that he chose to marry another doesn't necessarily void your obligations under the original agreement. Like hell it doesn't. Bo's words came out sharp enough to cut glass. The first real anger Clara had heard from him. No. But he can claim the second marriage was entered into under duress caused by the first party's breach. Mrs. Henderson's expression was grim as a funeral director's. Particularly if he frames it as an attempt to correct a wrong, to honor his original commitment despite the complications. Clara stared at the older woman, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. You're saying he could divorce his new wife to marry me? It's within the realm of possibility, especially if he presents it as a matter of honor, of keeping his word. Mrs. Henderson's tone suggested she found the whole business distasteful but legally sound. Men with sufficient resources and skilled attorneys can accomplish remarkable things. Miss Whitfield. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in until Clara could barely draw breath. She pushed back from the table and walked to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked orchard where she'd spent the morning believing she'd found some kind of sanctuary. How much time do we have? Bo asked. The telegraph is dated yesterday. If he's serious about pursuing this matter, we could see the sheriff within the week. Clara's reflection stared back at her from the dark window glass. A woman with tangled hair and a work-stained dress, looking nothing like the respectable bride Samuel Whitmore had contracted for. The woman in the reflection looked capable of carrying water buckets and saving dying trees. She also looked like someone who'd run out of safe places to hide. There might be another way, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice cutting through Clara's spiraling thoughts like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Both Clara and Bo turned toward her, hope and suspicion warring in their expressions. If Miss Whitfield were properly married to someone else, Mr. Whitmore's contract would be genuinely void. No court in the territory would force a woman to break her marriage vows to honor a previous agreement. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, heavy and somehow dangerous. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs, loud enough that she was certain both Mrs. Henderson and Bo could hear it beating. You're suggesting a marriage of convenience, Bo said slowly, testing each word like he was walking on thin ice. I'm suggesting a practical solution to a legal problem. Mrs. Henderson's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather or the price of grain at market. It wouldn't have to be a real marriage in any meaningful sense. Simply a legal arrangement to protect Miss Whitfield from Mr. Whitmore's claims. Clara's hands were shaking now, a fine tremor that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than muscle and bone. And afterward, when the threat passes, annulment, handled quietly and without publicity. It's not an ideal solution, but it's preferable to the alternatives. The alternatives. Clara didn't need them spelled out in detail. Return to Samuel Whitmore and a marriage based on legal coercion rather than any kind of affection. Fight the charges in court with no money and no influence against a man who had both. Run again, always looking over her shoulder for the next threat. "I need to think about this," Clara said, the words coming out steadier than she felt. "Of course you do, dear. But don't think too long." Mrs. Henderson moved toward the door, her hand already reaching for the latch. "Mr. Whitmore strikes me as the type of man who acts quickly when his pride has been wounded." She paused with the door half open, rain-scented air flowing into the warm kitchen. "Mr. Sawyer, I hope you understand that I take no pleasure in bringing you this news, but sometimes we have to choose between bad options and worse ones." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Clara and Beau alone in the kitchen with the weight of impossible choices pressing down on them like storm clouds. Clara continued staring out the window, watching raindrops race down the glass like tears on a mourner's cheek. Behind her, she could see Beau's reflection seated at the table, motionless as carved stone. "You don't have to do anything," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the steady drip of water from the eaves. "This mess isn't your fault." Clara turned from the window, studying his face in the lamplight. "Isn't it? He's threatening to bring charges against you because of me. I made the choice to offer you work. I'll face whatever consequences come from that. Even if those consequences include jail time, loss of your farm." Clara moved back to the table, sitting across from him again. "I won't let you sacrifice everything, because I was too stubborn to accept charity in town." Beau's eyes met hers across the small space, dark and steady in the flickering light. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe Mrs. Henderson is right. Maybe a marriage of convenience is the practical solution here." "Clara," his voice held a warning note, like distant thunder. "Marriage isn't something you enter into lightly, even for practical reasons. Neither is destroying someone's life because you were selfish enough to accept their kindness." They sat in silence, the lamplight flickering between them and casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, but water still dripped from the eaves with a steady rhythm that sounded like a clock counting down to some inevitable moment of decision. "Would you?" Clara asked suddenly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "If it came to that." Beau was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough around the edges, like sandpaper on raw wood. "I'd marry you tomorrow if it would keep you safe." The simple words hit Clara with unexpected force. Not a declaration of love or passion, but something more solid than either. A promise of protection, of partnership, of standing together against whatever storms might come. "It wouldn't be fair to you," she said. "Let me worry about what's fair to me." Clara studied his face in the lamplight, looking for signs of doubt or resentment or the kind of noble martyrdom that would make her feel guilty for the rest of her days. Instead, she found something steady and sure, something that looked like a man who'd made peace with difficult choices before and would do so again if necessary. "We should wait," she said finally. "See if Whitmore actually follows through on his threats." "Should we?" Before Clara could answer, a new sound reached them through the cabin walls. Hoofbeats again, but different this time. Multiple horses moving at a steady, purposeful pace, not the hurried gait of emergency or the casual rhythm of a social visit. Official business, the kind that arrived with badges and legal papers and the full weight of territorial law behind it. Bo rose from his chair, his hand automatically moving to check that his rifle was still in its place by the door. "Stay inside," he said quietly. But Clara was already moving toward the window, drawn by a terrible certainty about what she would see when she looked out into the rain-washed darkness. 3 riders approached the cabin, their forms outlined against the star-scattered sky. Even in the dim light, she could make out the glint of metal on the lead rider's vest, the unmistakable badge of law enforcement. The sheriff had arrived sooner than anyone expected, and he was carrying papers that would change everything, whether they were ready or not. The sheriff didn't waste time on pleasantries. He dismounted from his horse with the stiff movements of a man who'd ridden hard through mud and standing water, his boots making wet sucking sounds in the rain-soaked earth as he approached the porch. Bo Sawyer. His voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "That's me." Bo stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind him with deliberate care. Clara could hear every word through the thin cabin walls, each syllable sharp as broken glass. "Got papers here. Complaint filed by Samuel Whitmore regarding breach of contract and interference with lawful marriage arrangements." Clara pressed her face to the window, watching as the sheriff unfolded a document thick with official seals and formal script. Even from inside the cabin, she could make out the territorial seal and the kind of heavy paper that carried legal weight. Clara May Whitfield, present. She's here. Need to speak with her as well. Clara's legs felt like they were made of water as she moved toward the door. Her hand trembled on the wooden latch, and she had to try twice before she could work up the strength to turn it. The night air hit her face like a cold slap, carrying the smell of wet earth and something else, the metallic scent of authority and trouble. The sheriff was a lean man with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much of human nature's worst impulses. His 2 deputies flanked him, hands resting with casual purpose on their gun belts. "Miss Whitfield." The sheriff's gaze took in her appearance with the thoroughness of a man cataloging evidence: the work-stained dress, the tangled hair, the calloused hands that spoke of manual labor. "You contracted to marry Samuel Whitmore." "Yes, but contract's legal and binding according to territorial law. Mr. Whitmore is prepared to honor his commitments, provided you return to town immediately to fulfill your obligations." Clara's mouth went dry as desert sand. "He married someone else." "Temporary arrangement. Easily dissolved once the original contract is properly fulfilled." The sheriff's tone suggested this was a minor detail, hardly worth mentioning in the larger scheme of legal obligations. "Mr. Whitmore is willing to overlook the delay and any circumstances that may have occurred during your absence." The pause before circumstances made Clara's skin crawl like insects were walking on her arms. She could see exactly what Samuel Whitmore and his expensive lawyers had implied about her time at Bo's homestead, what conclusions they'd drawn, and what reputation they'd assigned to her. "I'm not going back to him." "Miss, you don't have much choice in the matter." The sheriff folded the papers and tucked them inside his coat with the finality of a coffin lid closing. "Contract law is clear as spring water on this point. You took his money, agreed to the terms. He's prepared to honor his part of the bargain." "What about my part?" Clara's voice came out sharper than she'd intended, scraping past her tight throat. "What about the fact that he abandoned the contract first by marrying another woman? That's a matter for the territorial courts to decide. Until then, you'll be coming with us." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, doubling her over as if someone had driven a fist into her stomach. She gripped the porch railing, feeling splinters bite into her palms as the world tilted sideways around her. "She's not going anywhere." Bo's voice was quiet, but something in his tone made both deputies straighten and shift their weight. Mr. Sawyer, I'd strongly advise you not to interfere with official territorial business. Official business that's built on lies and legal tricks. The sheriff's expression hardened like cooling iron. You calling Mr. Whitmore a liar. Son, I'm calling him a man who married another woman in anger and now wants to undo that mistake by claiming his original choice was still available. So Clara watched the exchange with growing horror, seeing how quickly the situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. The deputies had shifted their positions slightly, hands now resting with clear purpose on their weapons. "Bo, don't!" She stepped between him and the sheriff, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it pounding in her throat. "It's not worth the trouble." "The hell it isn't." "Mr. Sawyer." The sheriff's voice carried a warning as clear as a church bell. "You're already facing potential charges of interference with lawful contract. Don't add resisting arrest to that growing list." Clara felt something cold and heavy settle in her stomach like a stone dropped in deep water. "Arrest. Warrant's been issued. Interference with lawful marriage contract. Harboring property subject to legal claim." The sheriff's hand moved to the iron handcuffs hanging from his belt. "You can come along peaceful-like, or we can do this the difficult way." Property. The word echoed in Clara's mind like a funeral bell tolling. After everything, the journey west, the abandoned platform, the back-breaking work in the orchard, she was still nothing more than property to be claimed by whoever held the proper legal papers. "Clara," Beau's voice was soft but urgent, "you don't have to go with them." "Yes, she does." The sheriff produced a set of iron shackles from his belt, metal gleaming dull in the lamplight that spilled from the cabin doorway. "Unless you want kidnapping charges added to your troubles, Mr. Sawyer." Clara stared at the shackles, the same kind used on criminals and runaway slaves, designed to mark a person as less than human. Her hands began to shake as the full weight of her situation crashed down on her like a falling tree. "Please." The word slipped out before she could stop it, small and broken and desperate as a child's prayer. "Please don't put those on me." The sheriff's expression didn't change by so much as a flicker. "Sorry, miss. Orders are orders, and the law's the law." Clara held out her hands, wrists pressed together the way she'd seen criminals do in newspaper illustrations. The metal was cold against her skin, heavier than she'd expected, and each link of the chain seemed to carry the weight of her complete helplessness. The shackles closed with a click that seemed to echo through the night air like a gunshot. She was chained, bound like an animal or a piece of cargo, her hands locked together with iron forged specifically to remove human dignity. The weight of the metal pulled her arms down, made her shoulders ache with the sudden burden of legal bondage. "This is wrong." Beau's voice was rough with something that might have been rage or despair, or both combined into one terrible sound. "This is territorial law." The sheriff nodded to his deputies, who moved to flank Clara on either side like guards escorting a dangerous prisoner. "You've got 10 minutes to gather whatever belongings you need. Miss, then we ride." Clara stumbled back into the cabin, the chains around her wrists clanking with every movement like some medieval torture device. Her hands shook as she tried to pack her few possessions into the carpet bag that had carried her hopes from one failed future to another. The blue calico dress she'd worn on the train, a spare set of undergarments sewn from flour sack cotton, the small Bible her mother had pressed into her hands with trembling fingers before Clara left home. Everything she owned in the world, everything that defined her existence, fit into a bag no larger than a grain sack. Beau stood in the doorway watching her pack, his expression a mixture of fury and helplessness that made Clara's chest ache with something beyond mere sadness. "Take care of the trees," she said, her voice barely audible above the rattle of chains. "Clara, promise me." She looked up from her packing, meeting his eyes across the small room. "Whatever happens, don't let them die." Beau's jaw worked silently for a moment. muscles clenching and unclenching like he was chewing bitter medicine. "I promise." The ride to town passed in a blur of darkness and mud, and the steady clanking of chains against leather saddle horn. Clara sat behind one of the deputies, her shackled hands making it impossible to maintain proper balance. Every jolt and bump sent the iron cutting into her wrists, leaving raw welts that would scar. They rode through the orchard on their way to the main road, horses' hooves squelching in the rain-softened earth between the rows of struggling peach trees. Clara could see the containers they'd set out to catch rainwater. Many of them overturned now by wind or curious animals, their precious contents soaked uselessly into the ground. By morning, Bo would return to his endless routine of carrying water bucket by bucket, tree by tree. He would tend the orchard alone, the way he'd done before she arrived, the way he would continue doing long after she was gone. The jail was a squat stone building that crouched at the edge of town like a toad waiting for flies. Clara was processed with the same efficiency used for cattle at market. Name recorded in a leather-bound book, possessions catalogued and locked away. Cell assigned according to some system she didn't understand. The cell was barely large enough for the narrow cot and slop bucket that constituted its entire furnishings. The walls were rough stone, still damp from the night's rain, and the single small window was barred with iron as thick as a man's wrist. Clara sat on the edge of the cot, still wearing the shackles because the sheriff claimed he'd lost the key, and stared at her bound hands. The calluses from carrying water buckets were already beginning to soften, the honest marks of useful labor fading like everything else she'd tried to build. The iron had cut deep enough to draw blood in several places, and her wrists had swollen around the metal bands until removing them would have required cutting. She was marked now, branded as surely as any piece of livestock, and the scars would remain long after this nightmare ended. She was still sitting there when dawn light began to filter through the barred window, carrying with it the sound of approaching footsteps and the familiar jangle of keys. Samuel Whitmore had come to claim his property. But when the cell door swung open with a screech of rusted hinges, it wasn't Samuel Whitmore who stepped inside. It was Bo. His clothes still damp with morning dew and his face set in lines that spoke of a sleepless night and a decision that would change everything. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something else she couldn't quite identify. "Will you marry me?" Before she could answer, she saw what he held in his other hand. A piece of paper that looked official, covered with seals and signatures. But it wasn't what she expected. It was a bank notice, and from the look on Bo's face, it contained news that would destroy them both. Clara's hands were still trembling from the cold stone walls when Bo's words reached her through the damp morning air. The iron shackles had left angry red welts around her wrists, marks that throbbed with each heartbeat like a second pulse. "What did you say?" Bo stepped fully into the cell, his boots echoing against the wet stone floor. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and dark circles shadowed his eyes like bruises left by a sleepless night. He looked like a man who'd spent hours wrestling with the devil himself. "I said, will you marry me?" His voice was steadier this time, though Clara could see his hands shaking at his sides. "Right now. This morning." Clara stared at him, trying to make sense of words that seemed to come from another world entirely. "Bo, you can't just already talk to Judge Morrison. He's waiting at his house with all the proper papers." Bo's gaze moved to the shackles around her wrists, and something hard and dangerous settled in his expression. "Soon as we're married, Whitmore's contract becomes void. Can't force a woman to break marriage vows to honor a previous agreement." The cell door remained open behind him, but Clara felt no urge to run. Where would she go with iron chains marking her as escaped property? And beyond that, there was nowhere in the territory that the law couldn't follow. "What about you?" Clara's voice came out rougher than intended. scraped raw by a night of breathing stone dust and despair. What about your farm? Your trees? Whitmore won't just let this pass. Let me worry about Whitmore. I am worrying about him. And about you. Clara stood up from the narrow cot, chains clanking as she moved like some medieval ghost. You think marrying me will solve this, but all it'll do is paint a target on your back too. Bo was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the gray dawn light that filtered through the barred window. When he spoke, his words were measured and deliberate as a man choosing ammunition. You remember what you said yesterday about the trees drinking after the rain? Clara nodded, uncertain where this was leading, but grateful for any distraction from the weight of iron around her wrists. Been thinking about that all night, about how something that looks half dead can come back to life if it gets what it needs. His eyes met hers directly, no wavering or doubt in them. Maybe that's what we both need. Someone willing to stand when the drought comes calling. The simplicity of it hit Clara like cold water in her face. Not a declaration of love or passion, but something more solid than either. A partnership built on mutual need and shared stubbornness in the face of a world that seemed determined to grind them both down. Bo, her voice cracked on his name like dry wood splitting. I can't ask you to sacrifice everything for... You're not asking. I'm offering. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Multiple sets moving with official purpose and the weight of authority. Clara's stomach dropped as she recognized the sheriff's voice, along with another that made her blood turn cold as Winter Creek water. Samuel Whitmore, coming to collect what he considered his rightful property. Time's up, Bo said quietly, his words carrying the finality of a closing door. Yes or no? Clara looked at him standing in the doorway of her cell. This man who'd offered her work when she had nothing, who'd stood beside her in the pouring rain while dying trees drank deep of unexpected mercy. His face was set in determined lines, but she could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the fear that she might choose safety over trust. Yes. The words slipped out before she could second-guess herself. Simple. Final. A commitment made in a jail cell with shackles around her wrists and the sound of approaching doom in the corridor outside. Bo's shoulders sagged with relief so profound it looked like someone had cut the strings holding him upright. Sheriff's got the keys to those chains. Soon as you're released, we go straight to the judge. The voices in the corridor were getting closer now. Clara could make out Samuel Whitmore's cultured tones, smooth and confident as expensive whiskey poured over ice. I trust there were no complications with the prisoner. Sheriff, none whatsoever. Mr. Whitmore, she's been waiting for you. Quiet as a lamb. Clara's hands clenched into fists despite the iron cutting into her wrists, metal scraping against bone with a sound like grinding teeth. Bo, what if... No what-ifs. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that barely carried over the sound of approaching footsteps. Trust me on this. The sheriff appeared in the doorway, keys jangling from his belt like wind chimes in a storm. Behind him, Samuel Whitmore filled the narrow corridor with his presence, tall, well-dressed, radiating the confidence of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted when he wanted it. Miss Whitfield? Whitmore's gaze swept over her appearance with the thoroughness of someone inspecting livestock at auction. The wrinkled dress, the tangled hair, the raw marks on her wrists where the iron had bitten deep. His mouth curved in something that might have been a smile, if smiles could carry that much cold satisfaction. You look well-rested. Clara bit back the response that rose to her lips like bile. Nothing she could say would improve this situation, and everything depended on what happened in the next few minutes. Mr. Whitmore. The sheriff moved past Bo to approach Clara's cell, keys extended toward the shackles. As agreed, Miss Whitfield is ready for immediate transport to fulfill her contractual obligations. The iron fell away from Clara's wrists with a sound like breaking chains, taking skin with it and leaving wounds that would heal crooked. She rubbed the angry marks, feeling circulation return to her hands in painful tingles that shot up her arms like lightning strikes. "Actually," Bo said, his voice carrying clearly in the stone-walled space, "there's been a change in circumstances." Whitmore's eyes narrowed to slits. "What kind of change?" "The kind that makes your contract worth about as much as a handful of sand." Bo moved to stand beside Clara, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body like heat from a forge. "Miss Whitfield is about to become Mrs. Sawyer." The silence that followed was so complete, Clara could hear her own heartbeat echoing off the cell walls. Whitmore's face went through several changes: surprise, anger, then something cold and calculating that made her think of a snake coiling to strike. "That's impossible," he said finally, each word precise as a blade thrust. "The woman is bound by legal contract. She cannot marry anyone else without first fulfilling her existing obligations. Actually, she can—" Judge Morrison's voice came from the corridor behind them, carrying the authority of territorial law itself. "Marriage supersedes previous contracts of this nature. Has for decades under territorial statute." Clara turned to see the elderly judge squeezing past the deputies, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm and an expression of mild irritation on his weathered face. His presence seemed to fill the small space with legal authority that even Whitmore couldn't argue with. "Judge Morrison." Whitmore's tone remained polite, but Clara could hear steel underneath the surface courtesy. "Surely you're not going to allow this mockery of justice to proceed." "I'm going to perform a legal marriage between two consenting adults of sound mind." The judge opened his portfolio and removed a document covered in official seals and careful script. "Unless you have some legal grounds to prevent such a ceremony." Whitmore's jaw worked silently, muscles clenching and unclenching as he calculated angles and options. Clara could almost see his mind working, weighing the potential for legal challenge against the reality of territorial law. Finally, he stepped back with the measured dignity of a man making strategic withdrawal. "This isn't finished," he said quietly, the words carrying more threat than a shouted curse. "Yes, it is." Bo's voice was calm as still water, certain as sunrise. "Soon as we're married, your claim dies under territorial law. That's carved in stone." The ceremony took place right there in the corridor, with rough stone walls and iron bars serving as witnesses to their vows. Judge Morrison read through the legal requirements with the brisk efficiency of a man who'd performed countless marriages, his words echoing in the confined space like prayers in a cathedral. Clara spoke her vows in a voice that only trembled slightly, her hands still bearing the fresh wounds of Whitmore's legal bondage. Bo's responses were steady and sure, the voice of a man who'd made his choice and would live with whatever consequences followed. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The words hit Clara with unexpected force, settling into her bones like warmth from a winter fire. Married, to a man she'd known for less than a week, in a jail corridor, wearing a work-stained dress and the scars of iron shackles. It should have felt wrong, desperate, like a last resort chosen by people with no better options available. Instead, it felt like the first truly free choice she'd made since stepping off that train in Cedar Falls. Whitmore watched the proceedings with the cold attention of a predator studying wounded prey. When Judge Morrison declared them legally wed, something shifted in his expression, not defeat, but recalculation of strategy. "Congratulations," he said, the word sharp enough to cut glass. "I hope you'll both be very happy together." The tone suggested exactly the opposite. Clara felt ice settle in her stomach as Whitmore adjusted his coat and prepared to leave. His movements controlled and deliberate as a man laying plans. "Mr. Whitmore," Beau's voice stopped him at the corridor entrance. "Your business here is finished. My business is finished when I say it's finished." Whitmore's smile was thin as paper and twice as dangerous. "Enjoy your victory, Sawyer. But remember, marriage contracts can be dissolved just as easily as they're created, especially when they're based on fraud or legal coercion." He walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like a countdown to future trouble. Clara and Beau rode back to the homestead in silence, the morning sun burning away the night's dampness and turning the muddy roads into clouds of choking dust. Clara sat behind Beau on his horse, her arms around his waist, trying to process what had just happened and what it might mean. She was married to a man who'd saved her from one trap, but might have walked them both into another, larger one. Samuel Whitmore wasn't the type to accept defeat with grace, and his parting words suggested this was far from over. The orchard came into view as they topped the hill, rows of struggling peach trees catching the morning light like soldiers standing at attention. Most of the containers they'd set out during yesterday's storm were still in place, though some had been overturned by wind or wandering animals, their contents soaked uselessly into the thirsty ground. "We should check the trees," Clara said as Beau helped her down from the horse, his hands lingering on her waist for just a moment. "Trees can wait." His voice carried a note she hadn't heard before. "We need to talk about something else first." They sat on the front porch steps, morning heat already building despite the early hour. Clara studied her husband's profile. The words still felt strange in her mind, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped his knees like anchors. "Having second thoughts?" she asked. "No." The answer came without hesitation. But something in his tone made Clara look at him more carefully. "But we need to understand what we've gotten ourselves into." Clara nodded, though part of her didn't want to examine their situation too closely. For now, she was free of Samuel Whitmore's contract and legal claims. For now, she had a place to belong and work to do and someone who'd chosen to stand with her. It felt like enough. But Beau was right. They needed to face whatever came next with their eyes open. "Whitmore won't give up easily," she said. "No, he won't. Man like that doesn't take kindly to being outmaneuvered by folks he considers beneath him." Beau turned to look at her directly, his expression serious as a judge pronouncing sentence. "Question is, what are we prepared to do about it?" Before Clara could answer, she noticed movement in the orchard that made her stomach drop like a stone down a well. A figure was walking between the rows of peach trees, examining them with the focused attention of an expert conducting some kind of assessment, or someone looking for weaknesses to exploit. "Beau," her voice came out tight with sudden alarm. "Someone's in the orchard." They both stood, shading their eyes against the morning sun that was already beginning to press down like a wool blanket. The figure moved between the trees with clear purpose, stopping at each one to examine branches and check the soil moisture around their bases. As the person moved closer to the cabin, Clara could make out details that made her blood run cold as creek water in January. A well-dressed man in a business suit, carrying a leather portfolio thick with official-looking papers. A man who moved with the confidence of someone conducting legal business. A man who looked very much like he was taking inventory, or preparing an appraisal for foreclosure. The man in the business suit looked up from his notes as Clara and Beau approached, his face carrying the neutral expression of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news to folks who couldn't afford lawyers. His leather portfolio was thick with documents, and his boots remained clean despite the muddy orchard floor, the mark of someone who didn't plan to stay long. "Mr. Sawyer." His voice held the crisp authority of legal business conducted at arm's length. "I'm Thomas Caldwell, representing the Cedar Falls Bank. I need to discuss your loan payment with you." Clara felt Beau's body go rigid beside her, every muscle tensing like a man preparing to take a blow. The morning heat suddenly felt oppressive, pressing down like a weight that made drawing breath difficult. "Payment's not due for another 3 weeks," Beau said, his voice carefully controlled. Caldwell consulted his papers with the deliberate care of someone building an unshakable case. "Actually, there's been a review of your account status. Given recent developments in your personal circumstances, the bank has invoked the acceleration clause in your loan agreement." "What developments?" "Marriage changes a man's financial obligations. Mr. Sawyer, the bank needs assurance that your new domestic arrangements won't compromise your ability to meet existing commitments." Caldwell's gaze flicked to Clara, taking in her work-stained dress and the fresh scars on her wrists. "These are uncertain times, and the bank must protect its interests." Clara's hands clenched into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms hard enough to draw blood. She could see exactly what was happening. Samuel Whitmore's influence reaching through legal channels like poison spreading through clean water, applying pressure where it would cause the most damage. "The marriage doesn't affect my ability to work the land or meet my obligations," Beau said carefully, each word chosen like ammunition. "Perhaps not directly, but it does raise questions about your priorities and judgment." Caldwell's voice carried the cold certainty of someone delivering a prepared verdict. "The bank requires full payment of the outstanding loan balance within 30 days, or will be forced to initiate foreclosure proceedings." The words hit Clara like a fist to the stomach, driving the breath from her lungs and making the world tilt sideways. 30 days. In 1 month, everything Beau had worked for would be stripped away by men in clean suits who'd never carried a water bucket in their lives. "How much?" Clara asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Caldwell consulted his papers again with theatrical precision. $843, plus accumulated interest, late fees, and administrative costs. $800. More money than Clara had seen in her entire life combined. More than any small farmer could raise in 30 days, especially with a drought-damaged orchard producing nothing but withered fruit and broken dreams. "That's impossible, and you know it," Beau said, his voice flat as still water. "Nevertheless, those are the revised terms of your loan agreement." Caldwell closed his portfolio with the finality of a coffin lid. 30 days. Mr. Sawyer, the bank will expect payment in full." He walked away through the rows of struggling peach trees, his clean boots leaving precise impressions in the mud like grave markers. Clara watched him go, her mind racing through possibilities and finding none that led anywhere but deeper trouble. "How much do you actually owe?" she asked when Caldwell was out of earshot. 200, maybe 250 with legitimate interest. Beau's voice was hollow as an empty well. "They're adding fees and penalties that don't exist in any legal document I ever signed." "Can we fight it in court?" "With what lawyers cost money we don't have, and the bank's got connections that reach all the way to the territorial capital." Beau stared at the orchard with eyes that saw too much and hoped for too little. "They want us gone, and they've got the power to make it happen." Clara walked to the nearest peach tree and placed her palm against its bark. The wood was warm from the morning sun, and she could feel the faint pulse of life moving beneath the surface, weak but persistent, like hope in the face of overwhelming odds. "What about the harvest?" she asked. "What harvest? Half the trees are dead or dying from the drought. Even if the rest produce fruit, peaches won't bring enough money to cover $800 plus their made-up fees." Clara studied the orchard with new eyes, counting healthy trees and estimating yields with the cold calculation of someone facing mathematical impossibility. Beau was right. The drought had taken too heavy a toll. Even a perfect harvest wouldn't raise enough money to satisfy the bank's inflated demands. "Then we don't try to save the whole orchard," she said quietly. Beau turned to stare at her like she'd started speaking a foreign language. What? We save what we can and let the rest go. Clara moved between the trees, pointing to the healthiest specimens with the certainty of someone who'd found a new path forward. That one there, and that big one by the creek. Maybe 8 or 10 trees total that are worth the effort. Clara, that's not enough to make a living on. It's enough to make a start on something different. She turned to face him, her mind working through possibilities she'd never considered before this moment. We dig up the healthy trees, transplant them closer to the water source where they'll have a better chance. Use the cleared land for something else entirely. Like what? Clara looked around the property, seeing it not as a failing orchard but as raw possibility waiting to be shaped by willing hands and stubborn determination. Good soil, adequate water when properly managed, and 2 people who knew how to work hard when their backs were against the wall. Vegetables, beans, corn, squash, things that grow fast and sell steady in town. The ideas came faster now, building on themselves like a fire catching dry kindling. We keep a few peach trees for ourselves and maybe some preserves to sell, but we stop trying to make them carry the whole load. Bo was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across the struggling orchard with the expression of someone weighing dreams against harsh reality. Clara could see him calculating losses and possibilities, measuring the cost of abandoning his original vision against the price of losing everything. It would mean starting completely over, he said finally. We're already starting over, whether we want to or not. The truth of it settled between them like dust after a windstorm. The marriage, Whitmore's threats, the bank's impossible demands, all of it added up to the same inescapable conclusion. The life Bo had been trying to build was already gone, swept away by forces beyond their control. What remained was the choice between building something new together or watching everything disappear under the weight of other people's greed. 30 days isn't much time to transform a farm, Bo said. Then we better start now, hadn't we? They spent the rest of the morning walking the orchard, marking trees for transplant, and areas for clearing with the systematic thoroughness of military commanders planning a campaign. It was heartbreaking work, choosing which dreams to preserve and which to sacrifice for the possibility of survival. But with each decision, Clara felt something settling in her chest. Not resignation, but a different kind of hope built on practical foundations. By noon, they had a plan that might actually work. 8 peach trees would be carefully moved to a sheltered spot near the creek where they could be watered efficiently. The rest of the orchard would be cleared and planted with quick-growing vegetables that could be harvested before the first frost brought an end to the growing season. We'll need money for seeds and tools, Bo said as they sat on the porch, sharing cornbread and water, planning their campaign against impossible odds. Clara reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch she'd been carrying since leaving home, her life savings scraped together from years of careful economy. $43.27, representing every sacrifice and small denial that had brought her this far. It's not much, she said, placing the pouch on the wooden table between them. Bo stared at the money, then at her face, his expression unreadable. Clara, I can't take your savings. You're not taking them. I'm investing them in our future. She picked up the pouch and pressed it into his hands, feeling the calluses on his palms from months of carrying water buckets. In us. The afternoon passed in a blur of physical labor that felt different from their previous efforts to save dying trees. This wasn't about preventing death anymore. It was about choosing life, deciding what deserved to survive and what could be sacrificed for the greater good of building something sustainable. As they worked, neighbors began appearing as if drawn by some invisible signal. Mrs. Henderson arrived first, bringing a pot of beef stew and an offer to help with the digging despite the heat. Then the preacher's wife came with fresh bread and strong coffee that tasted like liquid encouragement. Even some of the men from town showed up, rolling up their sleeves and lending their backs to the effort without being asked. Tom Mitchell, whose own farm had been struggling with the drought, old Pete Garrison with his grown sons, the blacksmith and the feed store owner working side by side like they'd been neighbors all their lives. "Heard you folks might need some help," Tom Mitchell said, picking up a shovel with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who understood that communities survived by helping each other through hard times. Clara watched in amazement as their small project became something larger, not just two people trying to save themselves, but an entire community coming together to support neighbors in need. People who barely knew them were willing to spend their afternoon moving trees and clearing land, asking nothing in return, except the satisfaction of doing what was right. By evening, 6 trees had been successfully transplanted, their roots carefully wrapped and watered in their new home closer to the creek. The cleared areas had been roughly planned and marked, ready for fall planting once they could afford seeds and the weather cooled enough for delicate shoots to survive. Clara stood in what had once been the heart of the orchard, now an empty space marked by scattered leaves and disturbed earth that spoke of major changes. Tomorrow, this area would begin its transformation into something entirely different. The day after that, they would plant the first seeds of whatever came next. "You did good work today," Bo said, coming to stand beside her as the last of their helpers departed with promises to return when needed. Clara looked down at her hands, dirty, blistered again, marked with the honest evidence of useful labor. They looked like the hands of someone who belonged somewhere, who had found her place not through contracts or convenience, but through the simple act of choosing to stay when staying became difficult. "We did good work," she corrected, the word "we" feeling natural as breathing. They walked back to the cabin together as the sun set, their shadows stretching long across ground that was already beginning to look different from what it had been that morning. The future remained uncertain, Whitmore's continuing threats, the bank's impossible demands, the 100 challenges of building a new life from nothing but determination and community support. But for the first time since stepping off that train in Cedar Falls, Clara felt like she was moving towards something meaningful instead of running away from disaster. The cabin felt different too. She realized as they prepared their evening meal, smaller perhaps, but also more solid, more permanent. Clara moved through the kitchen with the familiarity of someone who truly belonged there, preparing food while Bo tended to the animals and secured the tools they'd use during the day. They ate dinner by lamplight, both too tired for much conversation but comfortable in the silence that comes between people who have worked hard together and earned their rest. The food tasted better than it had any right to. Simple fare made satisfying by honest exhaustion and the knowledge that they were building something worth preserving. Clara was washing dishes in the basin when she noticed Bo watching her from the kitchen doorway, his expression thoughtful. "What?" she asked, pausing with her hands in the soapy water. "Just thinking about this morning. About what we did." He stepped into the kitchen, picking up a dish towel to help with the drying. "You having any regrets about it?" Clara considered the question seriously, weighing the morning's desperate ceremony against the afternoon's hopeful labor. This morning, she'd been Clara May Whitfield, a failed mail-order bride facing forced marriage to a man who saw her as property to be claimed. Tonight, she was Clara Sawyer, partner in a struggling farm and willing participant in the hardest work she'd ever done. "I'm not sure I know who I am anymore," she said honestly. "But I know who I want to become." "And who's that?" Clara looked around the small kitchen, seeing it not as it was, but as it could be, a place where she belonged completely, where her work mattered, where she could build something lasting with her own choices and effort. "Someone who stays when staying gets hard," she said simply. They finished the dishes in comfortable quiet, then sat on the front porch watching stars emerge in the clear night sky. The air smelled of rain-washed earth and growing things, of possibility and new beginnings that felt solid as the ground beneath their feet. Clara was leaning back against the porch post, thinking about tomorrow's work. when Beau's voice broke the peaceful silence. Clara. His tone was different now, carrying something she couldn't quite identify. Yes. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something small that gleamed in the starlight. An old iron key, worn smooth by generations of hands. "This opens the front door," he said, holding it out to her. "Been in my family for 3 generations, passed down from father to son when a man found his true partner." Clara stared at the key, understanding the weight of what he was offering. Not just access to a house, but belonging, permanence. The right to call this place home not just for now, but for as long as she chose to stay. "Beau, you don't have to take it if you're not ready," he said quietly. "But I want you to know it's yours if you want it. For as long as you want it." Clara reached out and took the key, feeling its solid weight in her palm. The metal was warm from his body heat, and she could see the careful craftsmanship of someone who'd made it to last. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying more weight than any marriage vow they'd spoken that morning. As she closed her fingers around the key, Clara heard something that made her look up sharply. Hoofbeats on the main road, moving at a steady pace through the darkness. But these weren't the official sounds of law enforcement or the casual rhythm of neighbors paying social calls. These sounded urgent, purposeful, and they were heading straight for the cabin. Sometimes the stories we need most aren't the ones with perfect endings, but the ones that remind us how ordinary folks find extraordinary strength when everything falls apart. Clara and Beau's tale began with abandonment and desperation. 2 souls cast adrift by circumstances beyond their control. But in choosing each other, not out of romantic fancy, but out of practical necessity and growing respect, they discovered something more valuable than passion, true partnership. Their marriage wasn't born from courtship or convenience, but from the simple recognition that some battles are too hard to fight alone. In saving dying peach trees and building something new from the ruins of failed dreams, they learned that love isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's about showing up with work gloves and staying when the drought comes calling. Disclaimer. This is a work of fiction inspired by Western frontier stories, created solely for entertainment purposes. This story does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.